Thanks to Card Market for sponsoring this video.
Hi, I'm Marsh from StrataGames, and today we are talking about the SCGCon Pauper 1K in Cincinnati that happened this past weekend. A couple months ago when they announced their event list, me and a few other friends from our local Pauper group noticed that there were several small Pauper events, 3 rounds and you get some tickets, but there was no larger Pauper event on the schedule, and we wanted to change that. So my friend David, who runs the Ohio River Valley Pauper Discord, which is basically just a place for anybody in the Midwest region to try to coordinate Pauper events, decided to start a bit of an email campaign to SCGCon telling them that we had tons of Pauper players in the area and they should really consider setting up a 1K for us when they came into town. And luckily for us, they listened and did just that. So on Saturday, May 16th, we in fact had a Pauper 1K starting bright and early at 9 o'clock a.m. Here's the prize pool. First place was going to get $350. Entry to the event was $35, so you would 10x your money. Second place, $200. And down to if you get at least 8th, you make your money back and a little bit more. So I knew the 1K was coming up and I had to decide what I wanted to play at this event. Now, usually I just start with thinking about Black Sack. That's my main deck. It's a deck that I think is underrepresented and overly powerful, and a lot of people don't know how to play against it. You could do really well with this deck. But to be honest, I don't think it's extremely well positioned in the meta right now, and I actually took it to the Pauper Showcase Challenge last week, which I have a video up of. And if you watch that video, no spoilers, but I didn't do exceedingly well, and that put me off playing Black Sack for this 1K just a little bit. So my next deck that I usually go to is White Weenie, and I pretty much resolved that that was the deck that I was going to play. It's a deck I know very well. It's also very powerful. It usually has pretty good matchups against a lot of the meta, but something in my gut was just not sitting right with the idea of playing White Weenie. If I go up against a lot of aggro and mid-range and maybe even some control decks, I could absolutely wipe the floor with White Weenie, but if I go up against a lot of very hard control decks like Turbo Fog or combo decks, White Weenie usually doesn't thrive in those matchups quite as much, so I decided to go with Jund Wildfire, another deck that I play quite a bit on the channel and in person, but not one that I'd actually taken to a larger tournament like this yet, so I was a little bit nervous about it, but I know that playing it at FNMs and things like that, I can play it pretty fast. I'm not usually too worried of going to time, and I generally know the lines that you should be taking and how the deck should play. So breaking that down a little bit more, why did I decide on Jund Wildfire? Jund Wildfire is a very powerful deck. It's certainly tier 1, I would say, or if you want to go halves, maybe it's 1.5 or whatever, but it's very high up there. One of the best decks you can be playing. I particularly like it because it's got about 50% matchups against almost everything in the field. It is a little susceptible to some spell combo decks, things like Ruby Storm, but since that and similar decks usually rely on creatures which we can kill and the graveyard which we can nuke with Nile Spellbombs, I still think that this is a pretty good choice for just about anything. And to be honest, playing in some other 1Ks and Pauper Winner duels in the area, I know that the combo meta is not that prevalent in our area. Of course, that could have been a reason I could have played some more White Weenie, but again, ended up on Jund Wildfire. I also think Jund Wildfire just has one of the more powerful sideboards in the format. Getting access to 3 colors gives us just a ton of different cards that we can play. We have access to good hand attack, artifact, enchantment removal, board wipes, life gain, and even extra just traditional removal. I also know Jund Wildfire quite well, maybe not quite as much as Black Sack or even White Weenie, decks that I've written guides for, and I've spent hours and hours thinking about intricate lines and figuring out how best to communicate those to readers of a guide. But still, I've played endless leagues with Jund Wildfire, and I'm pretty comfortable with it in most situations, and I think it's just pretty well positioned in the meta right now. Pretty high up there, and not too many decks that just prey upon it, I don't think. So I'm on Jund Wildfire, but what is the rest of the meta looking at? Well, usually for my tournament reports, I put down a bunch of decks that I saw people playing or I played against or my friends told me about. And then I have an other category of 20 decks that I don't know what they were on. But thanks to Phil, aka Someone You Know PK, scraping the data from Melee, I actually have pretty complete data of every deck that people played and how well those did in the tournament, which is absolutely fantastic. So I should probably say we had 67 players who signed up for this tournament, which given the entry fee was actually enough for us to probably have a 2K. We over-delivered by almost twice as much as we needed for the tournament, which ideally just means in the future when they come back to town, we can ideally have an even larger tournament. So 67 players, and 5 of those players were on Mono Red Madness. This is the highest meta share of any deck at 7%, which is a really good percentage for the highest deck to have. That's something bigger like the last Paupergeddon. I believe Mono Red Madness was about 12% of the meta. Of course, that's a much bigger tournament. A lot easier to have more players doing that, but only 5 players on the same deck here at the highest is absolutely fantastic. We had 3 Elves, Grixis Affinity, and Jund Wildfire players, me being one of those wildfires, just under 6%. 3 Dimir Terror, Golgari Gardens, Mono Blue Terror, White Weenie, and Rakdos Madness. Then we get down to the 2s here, to Coggates, Bogles, Esper Affinity, Spy Combo, Gruul Ponza, Gruul Ramp, Mono Blue Fairies, Red Rally, White Heroic. We had 2 Simic Petitioners mill decks, and also 2 Pizza combo decks. playing Teamer. And then we had all of our one-ofs with an Abzan Soul Sisters list that was absolutely sweet, Azorius Fairies, Azorius Tribe combo, Boros Energy, Dimir Delver, Dimir Fairies, Flickertron, Golgari Food Gardens or Food Pestilence, Jeskai Synth, Mardu Synth, Orzhov Ephemerate, Orzhov Gates, and Ruby Storm. This is 33 different archetypes out of 67 players. Hard to ask for a more diverse meta to play against, which is always really fun. So that is the meta that we're working with. I said we're playing Jund Wildfire, but what was our deck list exactly? Well, here's a snapshot, and here's the deck where I can interact a little bit. Not that crazy of a Jund Wildfire list, I will say. I'm of course on 4 crystals, 4 refurbs. I decided to go with the 4 Gixian Infiltrator build, which is what I've been getting pretty comfortable with recently, and just been loving having the extra creatures. 3 Quark Clan Shamans, and 4 cast downs as removal. Of course, 4 Cleansing Wildfire. Makeshift Munitions is really key to this deck. Card draw, we have 4 Fanatical Offering, 2 Eviscerator's Insight, 4 Wellspring, 3 Lembas, 2 Nile Spellbombs. I modeled this list pretty closely off of the most recent list that I saw from Walker735 and Seasons of Mists, but with a couple minor differences. I like 21 lands over 20 lands, which is what they and everyone else seems to be playing. But every time I play 20 lands, I feel like I mulligan into the ground, and I almost never have felt like I have too much mana and nothing to do with it in this deck. So I think the mana base that they usually use is pretty perfect, with 4 Drossforge Bridge, 4 Slagwoods Bridge, 1 Forest, 2 Mountain, 3 Swamp, 4 Twisted Landscape, and 2 Vaults of Whispers. But I also like a Bajuka Bog taking the place of their 3rd Nile Spellbomb, filling a similar role, except we actually have a land drop, which again, I'm not usually upset to see. Then in our sideboard, again, modeled after theirs, but with a couple minor differences. 3 Weather the Storm, 1 Troublemaker Oof with 2 Ancient Grudge, something that I hadn't tried out before. 4 Artifact Hate here, 2 Breath Weapon, 2 Duress, 2 Fairy Macabre, because I only had 2. Their lists were running 3, and that could have been good, but I only had 2 on hand. And then Go for the Throat, and I did 1 Terminate, just to hedge a little bit against Guardian of the Guild Pact, in case we saw that, because Gates decks have been gaining a little bit of popularity, and I didn't want to be caught fully unprepared for that. And then I like a Toxin Analysis. I think people going fully away from this is a bit of a mistake. It's great against some Madness and Burn decks that you sometimes still have trouble with, gaining a bunch of life, but also it's still great giving Death Touch to Quark Clan Shaman, which can help against Gruul monsters or elves or anything like that. So this is the list that I was playing with. And now let's jump into the matches. Round 1, 9 o'clock in the morning, I started against a Dimir Terror player. He mentioned that he had only played a couple of rounds of Pauper before. He seemed pretty experienced in Magic, but obviously new to this format. I kept a pretty reasonable opening hand, and he was on the play. Starting with some mental notes that were pretty unlucky in the early game. I believe he milled a Terror and an Island with the first one. Obviously not setting things up for great success. I think on turn 2, after probably not countering anything, he mental noted again and hit another land and maybe 1 spell, so progressing pretty slowly, filling his graveyard, which forced him to use a Gurmag Angler, exiling the entire graveyard rather than being able to get any terrors down pretty quickly, and the Angler was met before it could hit me a single time with a cast down. I followed that up with a Spell Bomb, making it so that if he was able to refill his graveyard, I could take care of that pretty swiftly. As we were both playing lands and I was building up a little bit more mana and card draw, he landed a Mystic. I was able to cast down the Mystic. They did use a Snuff Out on a Chrysalis to get 1 bird out of it before it died, but otherwise was not too troublesome. I was able to land another Chrysalis and a Gixian Infiltrator though, and honestly just overtake the game pretty quickly from there. Between the unlucky mental notes, the fact that I cast down their first creature, and the Spell Bomb which wiped away their graveyard so they couldn't land any more terrors, they were out of it pretty quickly. Game 2 they led on a tap land, Contaminated Aquifer, and I played a Spell Bomb, immediately making sure that I could take out their graveyard pretty early. They cast a mental note, this time being a little luckier, hitting some random counter spells to fill their graveyard. And on their next turn, they played another mental note. I could have responded to the second one, knowing that if they get lucky, they could land a terror, and instead I could blow up their graveyard, but I didn't have mana up to draw with the Spell Bomb. I'd probably played a Nacre Wellspring or something like that, and decided that 1 terror I could probably deal with just fine. So they did, in fact, cast that terror. At the beginning of their next turn, I cracked the Spellbomb so that no more terrors could come down, so I'd only have to deal with the 1. Unfortunately, the 1 was down on their turn 3 on the play, and so it was actually dealing me a lot more damage than I anticipated. So I had a Gixian Infiltrator in hand, which I could play and try to start building up to get bigger than their terror, but I didn't have that many cards to sacrifice, no Chrysalis in hand or anything like that. This was my only creature, and I had a cast down, but I couldn't even cast it immediately because we were on turn 3. By the time I got to turn 4, he had Counterspell mana up, and I just didn't have a great follow-up to casting it down. If they had the Counterspell, then I waited a couple of turns. We took 15 damage off this terror, 3 hits, before I finally just had to go for the cast down. I believe they'd tapped down to 1 mana, so I was worried about a Spell Pierce, and if they had it, I would have just died. They did not, luckily for me, so I was able to stabilize a little bit, get an Infiltrator growing a little bit as well. think it got up to like a 6-5 over the next couple turns. But things were not looking great. My hand, I was stuck on 4 mana, I think, and my hand was just filled with value cards, but without things to sacrifice, and Cleansing Wildfire was just expensive to get anything going. They land another Tolarian Terror, and all I have is 1 Gixian Infiltrator. Because of some wildfires and stuff, I think I had 6 to 8 mana at this point, so I had a lot of ground to work with. My concern was that I was at 5 life, and all I had was 1 Gixian Infiltrator to block, so if they have any cast down, I would just die. But I had a ton of mana to look for something else with my card draw, so I Fanatical Offering to Vault of Whispers. All I need to find is one of my 4 Chrysalis, which makes a bunch of blockers. Even a Refurb means they'd have to have 2 kill spells. A Lembus would allow me to gain some life, so I'd have 1 extra hit. A Cast Down, or the Go for the Throats and Terminates, which I brought in, would allow me to kill the Terror. I had probably 15 hits in my deck that would give me at least 1 more turn to survive. Then I cast Fanatical Offering, and I drew lands and draw spells, and then I Eviscerator's Insight at the map, lands and draw spells, Cleansing Wildfire, lands and draw spells. And they cast down the Gixian Infiltrator and took that game 2. That looks like I was in a pretty good spot from, but I'd just taken too much damage early. Maybe I should have cast down that first Terror a little bit earlier and not been as scared of the counterspell. They didn't end up having he didn't end up having the counterspell, so it's possible that if I had cast it down earlier, I could have saved myself 1 or 2 hits and then not died so quickly to this Terror. So could have been a bit of a misplay, but definitely quite a bit of unluck. In any case, in game 3, I was on the play, and my opening hand was exactly this. This is probably the only hand that I remember exactly what I opened with. 2 Bridges, a Vault of Whispers, an Ichor Wellspring, and 3 Writhing Chrysalis. I figured all I need to do is draw 1 land and I probably win the game, because it's going to be very hard for him to have kill spells or counter spells for every single Chrysalis. And even if he does, I get a million chump blockers, a million mana along the way, and I'll be pretty well set up. And then my top deck on turn 1 was Cleansing Wildfire, which is the perfect card to draw, because not only did it give me my land, it also made it so that I had a turn 3, 4, 5 Chrysalis instead of 4, 5, 6. His hand seemed okay, but it just was no match for what I would consider me having pretty much the nuts. I landed 3 Chrysalis, and I think I killed him on turn 5 with just a bunch of enormous creatures. So I won round 1, going to the next one 1-0. And we sat down against Grixis Affinity. I think Grixis Affinity is generally a good matchup for Jund Wildfire, but between Black Mage's Rod, Makeshift Munitions, and Galvanic Blast, Grixis Affinity can often get a nice burn win and steal some games, so that's one of the things that I usually want to try to avoid. They did in fact land a Black Mage's Rod on turn 2 on the play, which definitely made me start panicking a little bit. I did have a Krark Clan Shaman in hand, so they started pinging me a little bit with Thought Casts and things like that. Attacked with the Black Mage's Rod on 1 turn when they were able to, before I landed the Krark. So I think I took 4 or 5 damage from this. I played Krark, but I decided not to use it right away, mostly because I didn't have any artifacts except for lands to sacrifice, and I didn't really want to go that deep. They were having a little bit of trouble, though. No blue mana on their side of the field, which I'm realizing now means they definitely didn't Thought Cast. They must have just cast an Ichor Wellspring or something like that. But then eventually they land Emir Enforcer. We've played a couple artifacts this time, and I do want to kill the token on the Black Mage's Rod, so they've tapped down to just 1 black or red mana, and I decided it's time to go for the Krark Clan Shaman, sacking a Wellspring, a map, a Refurb, and 1 land to kill both of their creatures. They Galvanic Blast with a Black Mage's Rod trigger in response. I go down to 11 damage, but I wipe their board, draw a card for our troubles, and I think we'd wildfired or something, so losing the land was not that big of a deal. A couple turns go by and they don't draw extremely well, whereas we're drawing creatures, and I amass this board very nicely. They're in some serious trouble, but they do land a Makeshift Munitions on the field, and I'm at 11. They have 6 lands, I think, so not quite able to kill me yet. However, when I go to attack with some of my creatures, they then Galvanic Blast a couple of them down. I believe they kill the Infiltrator and the Refurb, because those are the ones that they can. Or maybe they use the Galvanic Blast plus Munitions to kill a Chrysalis or something like that. But they made a classic mistake that I think we've all made with Makeshift Munitions, which is that they forgot they could just go to the face. They had 2 more Galvanic Blasts and I was at 11. That easily puts me to 3, and the Makeshift Munitions finishes me off. They just tunnel visioned on the fact that I had a lot of creatures and that they were going to kill them in a couple of turns. And so they killed those instead, made a bit of a misplay, and I took the first game because of it. Because they killed a couple creatures but were not able to kill the other ones, and the Chrysalises finished them off. So got a little bit lucky there, but it happens sometimes. Game 2 goes way better for us to start. We're the ones with the Makeshift Munitions, as well as an Infiltrator and a Chrysalis pretty early on. They play some Wellsprings. I think they play 3 Wellsprings throughout the game, which generally is a great card, but they didn't have a lot of ways to sacrifice them. They were spinning their wheels quite a bit, and I think the creatures that they got, maybe a Refurb or another Black Mage's Rod, I could just ping off with the Makeshift Munitions. They didn't see any, or maybe many, Thought Casts. Their hand got depleted very quickly. We were able to take a pretty quick game 2. putting us into the 2-0 bracket. Then we went up against Elves. Generally, I felt like Elves was a pretty favored matchup for Jund. As long as you don't get all your lands blown up by Masked Vandals, Krark Clan Shaman can really help you win the game. But he was on the play and started with a very fast start of Elvish Mystic into turn 2 Priest of Titania. He'd also cast a land grant, showing me his hand, and that meant that I knew there was an Avenging Hunter in there that was going to come down on turn 3 if I didn't do something about their Priest and their Mystic. I had several tap lands, unfortunately. I did have a Krark, though, so I really didn't want to, but I had no other creatures in hand and felt that if they landed the Avenging Hunter, I was going to die right away anyway. So on turn 2, I played the Slagwood's Bridge after I already had the Drawsforge on the field, played Krark Clan Shaman, sacrificed one of our bridges to wipe the Priest and the Elvish Mystic. Again, I didn't love the look of this, but this left them with 2 lands. They might have had a third land in hand, but certainly no Avenging Hunter on turn 3, and I don't think even a path to get it on turn 4. This could buy us the time that we really needed. Unfortunately, they then top-decked Masked Vandal. They had not shown it in the land grant, and I had just killed some of their creatures, and so we lost one of our lands. So after losing one of our lands to ourselves and then one to our Masked Vandal, we were quite behind, but that's okay because we were still recovering. We played another Abridge, and we knew they had no more Masked Vandals, and then they top-decked Winding Way into Masked Vandal, and you know how that goes. So we lost that game really quickly. We started with the Slagwood's Bridge in game 2. We had a hand with a Krark, a Wellspring, and some other good cards for the match. On the play, I was feeling pretty decent. They started again with a 1-drop elf that taps for a mana, land grant. This time they show us the Masked Vandal, but they don't have a Generous Ent or any way to fill their graveyard with a creature. So I should be okay for a couple of turns. Again, I have that Krark Clan Shaman, but I only have 2 lands in hand, and I really need to make sure to find some more. Plus, I don't want to be sacking lands to the Krark, so I play a Vault of Whispers, play a Ichor Wellspring to try to draw another land. I don't get it there, but maybe I'll get it next turn. And then they top deck Generous Ent, and then they cycle it, and then they Masked Vandal, and I never draw another land, and that's my round against Elves. So generally favored, I think, if I don't get all my lands blown up. However, they blew up all our lands, and we lost. Round 4, I was against Petitioner's Mill. This is the same player that I played against at one of the Win-a-Duels in the top 8, playing the same Petitioner Mill deck. So I already knew going in that she would probably be playing the same thing. If you don't know this deck, Persistent Petitioners wants you to have 4 advisors to mill a player for 12, and you play a bunch of cheap advisors that give a little bit of incidental value, like Pawn Prophet, which draws a card. You usually mill yourself 12 once or twice, fill your own graveyard with Gnawed of the Bone and Moment's Peace to gain a bunch of life and prevent damage, before you then mill your opponent out. Game 1, I had quite a few removal spells, so every time a Persistent Petitioners came down onto the field, I would just cast it down right away. This kept her off 4 advisors for the Petitioners for several turns, and then I was able to Bajuka Bog away the creatures that were there. I think there was also a Gnawed of the Bone or something that had been discarded from a Refurbished Familiar, so I got a little bit of value that way. And frankly, she got extremely flooded, I think 7 lands or something like that, in the deck that probably only wants 3 to 4. So with a couple of my removal spells, never got to that 4th advisor, and I was able to just lay down a Gixian Infiltrator, start sacrificing things to it, and with her having no hard removal, was eventually able to take that game pretty quickly. For the sideboard, this is the first time I've ever done this in a sideboard. I took out Writhing Chrysalis. Now, there were some good sideboard cards I wanted to bring in. Fairy Macabres, hits Gnawed of the Bone, Moment's Peace, go for the Throat and Terminator, just more creature removal spells. And I was looking at what I wanted to cut, but usually what I would cut is a Krark Clan Shaman if it's not good in the matchup, but it's really good here. All their creatures are on the ground. I would maybe cut a Nihil Spellbomb, but they're a graveyard deck, so I'm not doing that. Lembas was pretty much the only card that I was okay cutting, and I only had 3 of those in the deck. And I had these 4, and I think maybe one other card I wanted to bring in. Toxin Analysis, maybe. But I just realized that all I needed to do was stop them from using their combo to mill. I really didn't need 12 threats in my deck, and one Gixian Infiltrator grows a lot bigger than Chrysalis. It's also cheaper, so I can get it started earlier. The main drawback is that it doesn't come with its own sacrifice fodder, but I figured with them having no removal to get rid of it, it would get big enough at some point that it was probably better than Chrysalis, so that's what I tried. And it worked pretty well. We started with a Gixian Infiltrator and a Munitions early, so I was able to just throw random artifacts that I had, maps and Ichor Wellsprings and things like that, at all of the 1 toughness advisors they had, so that they would have to chump block the Infiltrator, which was growing bigger and bigger with higher toughness creatures like advisors themselves. I didn't have quite as much removal this time for creatures with higher toughness, so they had a Petitioners and the Glistener Seer out, and then in a single turn played Persistent Petitioners and then Moth Dust Changeling, and were able to get a mill off before I was able to kill the Changeling with the makeshift munitions. Milled themselves, which gave them a Gnaw to the Bone, as well as like 10 creatures in the graveyard, so they were gaining 20 life off of it. However, I still had my Gixian Infiltrator. I landed a Krark Clan Shaman, sacrificed 3 artifacts to wipe their board, and then on their end step they cast a Knot to the Bone to gain 20 life. I think they did that twice actually, so they were up to 59 life. But I was able to Fairy Macabre away 2 Moment's Pieces so that I wouldn't have to worry about those. And then I just had 1 Infiltrator, which was dealing 10-ish damage that I attacked over and over and over with. And they were not able to get out of that. The board wipe plus Graveyard Hate was really strong. And generally, I would say this is probably a pretty favored matchup. Round 5, we were up against the Mirror, Jund versus Jund. This is actually someone who came up to me a couple hours before and said that he watched the content. So if you're watching, I enjoyed playing against you. That said, I could not remember a lot of the exact games that we played. Jund versus Jund, it was a lot of Cleansing Wildfire, Fanatical Offering. I know in both games we played a lot of Chrysalis and then we cast down each other's Chrysalis, but I don't know. Most of these matches I can remember pretty well. The Jund matchup I feel like is quite a blur. I will say I think that my opponent got pretty unlucky. I feel like I was able to do the perfect Jund thing the majority of the time. Wellspring into Fanatical Offering, early Cleansing Wildfires, and they were drawing a lot more lands and just not quite as much value, which led to me at one point looking at my hand of 8 cards, choosing what to discard, realizing my opponent only had a single card in hand. I was able to get this match in 2 games, but again, unfortunately, can't remember exactly in the Jund slog what exactly happened. I tried to remember to take some more notes on the matches in this tournament, and I forgot again. I get very overwhelmed with a lot of people and just forget any plans that I had originally. In any case, we went on to round 6. I was up against Rakdos Madness. I was actually playing against one of my friends who plays at my LGS, so knew going into it what he was on. He also knew what I was on. And unfortunately, we were both 4-1. And based on the math we'd be doing, it seemed very unlikely a 5-2. It seemed very unlikely if you go 5-2 that you were going to make top 8. So this match was pretty important for both of us. And he had an extremely good start. I think it was Jagged Barons on turn 1 into a Faithful Saluting Kitchen Imp on turn 2. Swing for 2. Also, I think in that Faithful Saluting discarded a Snacker, which was going to come back later. I don't think I had a Cleansing Wildfire or anything early, but I did have a cast down, so I made sure the Kitchen Imp did not hit me a second time. He did get out 2 Kitchen Imps, I think, later with potentially that same Faithful Saluting flashed back, hitting in for 4 before I was able to deploy a couple Writhing Chrysalis to make sure those Kitchen Imps couldn't get in any longer. I got a 3rd Chrysalis down and was really building up an army, but I was at like 5 life and they had a couple Kitchen Imps, so I was pretty hesitant to attack for a little while. I did get a couple Lembas throughout, which I immediately sacrificed to gain some life, and I could sense that the damage was petering out a little bit from the opposing side, but I was down to about 5 and was pretty worried that we were going to die at some point, but I also realized that I had very little choice and I needed to start attacking. So I attacked with 2 of my Chrysalis. I think they were 4 or 5 power each. I think I hit in for like 8 damage and brought them down from 27, since they gained several life, to like 19, leaving back a Chrysalis and a Spawn to block. I think the Snacker died along the way, but then got brought back because I remember the board state being Gurmag Angler, Kitchen Imp, and a tapped Snacker. I had a Chrysalis that could be a 4/5 if I sacrificed my 1 last Spawn, also up, so I could block the Kitchen Imp and the Gurmag Angler if they attacked in. I was at 5 life and they attacked with this Gurmag Angler, which would be lethal. I chump blocked with the Eldrazi, sacrificing it and growing all of our Chrysalis. All he left back was a Kitchen Imp, and he was at about 19 life. Now I top decked a cast down, killed the Kitchen Imp, and realized with some math that my 3 Chrysalis were dealing 23 damage and they were at 19 with no blockers. So I figured this should be game ideally, so I swung in with everything. I was a little worried because he had a Blood Up and 1 card in hand, and if that card was a Kitchen Imp that he could Madness chump block with, then I would die on the crackback. However, I think I decided he probably didn't have a Kitchen Imp because he probably would have done that main phase, because it would have been a second attacker in the air, which would have been 2 damage I couldn't block, and if he had drawn a Lightning Bolt or any 3 damage spell off of that blood token, he would have killed me. So I had ruled out that there could have been a Kitchen Imp. I went for the attack. It actually was an Alms of the Vein, which he did cast off this blood token, dropping me to 2 life and him being brought up to 22. Now I was still dealing 23, and so unless he drew a Lightning Bolt or a Fiery Temper, which he did have 3 mana for, I was going to win. And luckily for me, he just drew a land. So a very close game 1 that I definitely thought he was going to win, but I ended up taking. Game 2, I kept a bit of a slow hand. I had a Drawsforge Bridge and a Vault of Whispers and a Duress and a Spellbomb. On the draw, usually I would start with my tap land, and then the next turn I would play my 2-drop or maybe my Duress and my Spellbomb. But I was worried about a Cast Into the Fire, being able to take my first bridge, maybe some PTSD from the Vandal, maybe some PTSD from Masked Vandal earlier. But I decided there wasn't a lot of downside to just leading on Duress, maybe sniping a draw 2, and then the following turn I could spellbomb. If he had multiple draw 2s and a snacker, this would allow him to get the snacker through the spellbomb, which I could have started with, but I felt this was the way to go. He had mulliganed to 5, maybe 6, but already had only 4 cards in hand. Might have been a mulligan to 6 with a Voldaren Epicure turn 1. Trespasser's Curse, Kitchen Imp, and a land. I was not expecting the curse, but this does ping for 3 off of Writhing Chrysalis, and just 1 off of Refurb and Gixian Infiltrator and stuff like that. So it was an interesting one. I didn't have a choice. These were the only cards to take, so I stole one of these, leaving him with a Kitchen Imp and another curse. He cast one of the curses on me. I played a Refurb, which pinged me for 1, but he was tapped out, so he had to discard a land or something like that. Next turn, played that Kitchen Imp that he had in hand off of a blood token, I think. He probably did have that Voldaren Epicure after all. Attacked with it, and I traded with the Refurb. His draws were a little rough, mostly just lands, and so I started landing Chrysalis after Chrysalis. I played 2 of them, draining for a lot with the curse, but I did have a plan, so I went from 13 to 10 for the first Chrysalis, then down to 7. But again, he was pretty much showing jazz hands, playing a bunch of lands, so I wasn't too worried of dying from 7. But my goal was with these Chrysalis, I had a Toxin Analysis, and then I top-decked a Weather the Storm in hand, so the Toxin was so that I could grow a big Chrysalis and gain a bunch of life from that. But with the Weather the Storm and now 4 spawn on board, I was also able to just cast a ton of spells. So I cast, I think, a Cleansing Wildfire, Ichor Wellspring into Toxin Analysis, Weather the Storm, gain 12 off the Weather, then attack, gain 6 off the Toxin Analysis. I jumped from 7 up to 25 life in a single turn. And from there, we played it out for a couple more turns, but he had already had some pretty bad draws, a rough mulligan, and suddenly up to 25. I don't think I dropped below 15 by the end of the game. I was able to take that one, going 5-1. We did some math, and 5-1-1 was a lock-in for top 8. There were no 6-0s because the 2 5-0s in the previous round both intentionally drew as well. So there were going to be 2 5-0-2s probably, and there was a total of 5 5-1-1s, which actually meant that 1 5-2 was going to be able to make it into the top 8, which could be my buddy I played against with Rakdos, or it could have been someone else. I would have been playing against Gruul Panza, which is, I think, a pretty okay matchup for me. Of course, we have artifact lands that can't get blown up by their land destruction spells, but also the other lands that we have that are quite destructible are very key. We need a lot of mana, so it's definitely a toss-up, but we did not end up playing, and I was able to get a much-needed break for a little while before we found out the top 8. We had, going left to right, the Elves player that I had lost to in round 3, a Teamer Pizza Combo player, the Gruul Panza player that I split or intentionally drew against, Mardu Synthesizer, a Grixis Affinity, Dimir Fairies, this was a Dimir Tempo Fairies, as opposed to the control variant that I like more, myself on Wildfire, and then our 5-2, which just made it in on Tiebreakers, Dimir Terror. A beautiful looking top 8 with 8 different archetypes ranging from combo to mid-range to control/tempo. The only thing really missing here is more of an aggro deck, although I think Panza you could maybe call an aggro deck. Terror, maybe an aggro deck. That one's a little tougher to make work, but you'll love to see 8 different archetypes in the top 8. So this was the breakdown for the top 8 bracket. We had Dimir Fairies versus Dimir Terror, Teamer Pizza Combo versus Mardu Synth, Elves versus Jund Wildfire, that's me, and Gruul Panza versus Grixis Affinity. So, jumping into my quarterfinals match against Elves. This is a rematch against the same Elves player that I played against. Unfortunately for me, the top seat was able to choose whether they wanted to go first, because they had a better record than those of us on the bottom here, which meant I was on the draw. He led on an Elvish Mystic, I led on a Drossfarge Bridge. Then at the beginning of his turn 2, he cycled a Generous Ent, and while he was shuffling, he said, "Don't worry, it's coming." And I immediately moved my bridge to the exile zone. A moment later, he played the Masked Vandal, and we had a repeat of those same games as before. I don't remember if he blew up a second one of my lands, but the first land was important enough. He landed Avenging Hunter on turn, I guess it would have had to be 4 here. I did not lose a land before my turn 3, which happened every other game. And I finally had a Cleansing Wildfire early, so even if he did take a land, I at least replaced it with the Cleansing Wildfire. Had a nice turn 2. And he actually had a very slow start. I wish I saw some more of these during the Swiss and some other games, but he started turn 1 with a Viridian Longbow. He mentioned this after our match in the Swiss. He brought this in against Krark Clan Shaman to make sure it doesn't gain Toxin Analysis, and just to force it to be used at a certain time rather than it waiting around longer, which makes some sense. Turn 2, he Winding Wade, so there were no creatures on the board for the first 2 turns, which made things considerably easier for me at the start. I did just start building up some Wellsprings, and I had a Krark Clan Shaman, but didn't need to deploy it quite yet, because he had not that many creatures on the board. But when he started playing creatures, they were unfortunately, and probably smartly on his part, not that susceptible to Krark-Clan Shaman. It was either flyers like Sagu Wildling or Vitu-Ghazi Inspector, a 2/4 if you pump itself. That is not even something that I really desperately want to kill. But if I don't kill it, then we have issues with like the Viridian Longbow being put on it and being able to kill a Krark, and it just blocks our refurbs and things like that, so we can't get in for some chip damage, and we go for a much longer game. Now, generally, I don't mind a longer game, so I was able to land a Chrysalis, get an Infiltrator that started growing. I was even able to start attacking in with some of our creatures. I believe I got him down to 5 life. Of course, he wasn't chump blocking, and he had gained some life from Saga Wilding and Vitu-Ghazi Inspector, so it took a little bit to get there. But he had a Quirion Ranger on board, bestowed a Hydra onto, I think it was a Rooftop Percher, and then got a Timberwatch Elf down, which immediately made it so that I could no longer attack. Oh, I forgot to put in here, he also had a Crashing Drawbridge, which could give haste to everything. So Timberwatch Elf hit the field, and immediately it could have haste and pump a creature or 2 creatures for +4 twice, which made it so my attacks immediately had to halt. Not to mention, I think he'd gotten in for some damage with the Saga Wildling throughout the game, and so I was at 12. He had a 3/3 Rooftop Percher with a 1/1 Nyxborn Hydra bestowed onto it, Timberwatch being able to buff it to be a 12/12. Attacked in with this. I had a 4/5 Chrysalis and a 6/7 Chrysalis. I blocked with both of those and a Refurbished Familiar. He pumped it to be 12, so he was able to take out both Chrysalis. I got to keep my refurb. Amazing. Just to kill his Rooftop Percher, and his Trampler and his Nyxborn Hydra Trampler survived. I was at 12 life, so I couldn't take all of it. If I only took a little bit of it, I was just losing creatures anyway, so I might as well trade for at least something. He also still had the Viridian Longbow on the field, and with a Quirion Ranger, this can make for a pretty decent combo. Being able to pick off our refurbs, or just deal 2 damage to us every turn, or actually 3 damage in a cycle, because he can untap on my turn and his turn, which was another reason I wanted to try to keep my life total a little bit higher. I did manage to find a Toxin Analysis, but I had not seen a second Krark yet, and I eventually found a Breath Weapon, which I used to wipe the 1/2 Nyxborn Hydra that was still around, a Quirion Ranger, and I think something else. This must have been after I got a cast down for the Timberwatch Elf, otherwise that would have kept 2 creatures alive. So I was doing a great job at stalling, killed the Timberwatch so he couldn't attack in, then Breath Weapon to kill the Quirion and the Hydra. I still had a Toxin Analysis. I was waiting for a Krark because he still had some other creatures, Masked Vandals and things like that were a little larger. He did have some Vandals by this point, but they were just taking lands when I already had like 8, so it wasn't that big of a deal. Unfortunately, I had so many lands because I was not drawing that many card draw spells, and not because I had Cleansing Wildfired so many times. So I had this Toxin Analysis, but I was also going down on life. I was at like 4 at this point, and he had a Viridian Longbow that could keep tapping to ping me. I killed the Quirion Ranger, so it was still a 4-turn clock, but I was getting a little desperate. And the Toxin can also draw me a card, so eventually I attacked with another Chrysalis that I had accumulated, Toxined it. I think I was able to gain 6 life off of that, but he had a Saga Wildling and I think another Rooftop Percher at this point. They were able to attack back in for 6. In any case, things stabilized again for a little while, and over the next 3 turns, I drew a land, and a land, but one that I could cycle, so I cycled that for a Cleansing Wildfire, and so I cast that on a bridge, and my deck was maybe 12 cards big at this point, and I saw what was in there, pulled out a basic, and then I drew a land anyway. So I ended up losing in the quarterfinals against Elves, the only player that I had lost against all day. It was a bit unfortunate. I didn't love either of those losses, but I can't say that I didn't play pretty well, I think. Match 1 and game 1 of match 2, I just got obliterated by the Masked Vandals that were a little bit too stuck to his hand, it seemed. And this game 2, in the last 12 cards of my deck, were 2 of my 3 Krark-Clan Shamans, another one of my 2 Breath Weapons, both of my Eviscerator's Insights. I even checked my graveyard at one point because I was like, with so much mana on board, 8 mana that I was passing every single turn for. I checked my graveyard just to say, did I forget that I had an Eviscerator's Insight in here? Because I was looking so desperately for something to do with my mana. And no, both of them were in the deck still. 2 of my 4 Fanatical Offerings, at least 1 Wellspring, and of course, 2 or 3 of my Lembas because I was cracking those and they were getting shuffled back in. So I will say I prefer the 21 land version. This was the only game the entire day and one of the few games ever playing the deck where I felt that I didn't have anything to do with my mana and that I would have liked to have more spells rather than lands. I still prefer the 21 land deck, but this game is a potential one that I could have won if I had just one more card draw or something like that. But I also just think that all of my good cards were on the bottom, and by that point in the game, even if I got a Krark or something to fully wipe their board, I'm not sure my deck actually had ways to win the game in it at that point because it was all card draw that I wish I had gotten a lot sooner. In any case, back to our bracket here. I did lose that match, so I was out, getting, I believe, 8th place by the end of it, but still top 8, not bad. Demir Terror won over Demir Fairies. Teamer Pizza Combo beat out Mardu Synth. Elves beat Jund Wildfire, and Gruul Panza beat Grixis Affinity. Then those matches battled, and we got down to our finals, which was Teamer Pizza Combo versus Gruul Panza. And after what I'm sure was a very interesting, long, drawn-out match, we have our winner for the Pauper 1K at SCGCon Cincinnati, which was Teamer Pizza Combo. There were only 2 players playing this deck, and one of them took down top prize. They also snapped a picture of the winner here, which is, you may know him as Phil, aka Someone You Know PK, the player who also assembled all of that metadata we looked at earlier, taking down the whole thing with a relatively new combo deck, which is pretty sweet. Congrats to Phil. And that was the tournament. I don't think we could have asked for a better tournament. We made it a 1K because we were worried that maybe we wouldn't even be able to get 30 players. We ended up with 67 players with 33 different deck archetypes, only one deck with even 5 pilots, a top 8 with 8 different archetypes, showcasing tons of different colors and strategies, and then one of the more niche and newer decks taking down the whole thing. Really sweet. The only thing we could ask for is to ban Masked Vandal. Thanks so much to my supporters who make it possible for me to make videos like this. If you want to support me on a monthly basis, go ahead and check out my Metafy link down below, or you can join my YouTube memberships where you can get early access to videos. Thanks to my current $10 and up supporters, Howard Granger, JDNPX, Halkaz, Cody Cowell, DJ Vinyl, In Buns We Bust, Brotaku BC, Mr. Soleo, and Paladillin C. I really appreciate your support, and I will see you all next time.